We're going to return to our top story right now and get reaction to the government decision to file an appeal in the long-standing bitter fight over compensation for Indigenous children who are affected by discrimination within the child welfare system. We're going to bring in Cindy Blackstock, the executive director of the First Nations Family Caring Society. That is the group that filed the initial human rights complaint in 2007, along with the Assembly of First Nations. She's here in Ottawa. Ms. Blackstock, can you explain to us what's happened here? We got the notice of appeal, but we now have this statement from the government saying that perhaps this is what's known as a protective appeal. So what is happening right now?
Well, they filed an appeal and they say they want to quash the compensation order. At the same time, they've said, look, we're willing to sit down and see if we can finally settle this and stop the discrimination. The Caring Society, job number one for us is stopping the discrimination from continuing to happen, because it's still happening to kids. They're still getting underfunded, and that's putting families at risk and children into foster care, and also it's denying kids life wellness services. So we have to have this discrimination stop, and then we have to make sure that all of these victims and these families receive the legal compensation that the federal court said they deserve, which is $40,000 each. The federal government could pay more if it wants, but that's the baseline.
So just so that I understand, the appeal was filed by the government, but there's going to be a pause in the proceedings so that all parties can sit down and have a conversation to try and get to a goal by December of 2021. Am I reading that correctly?
That's right. And if there is no deal, Katie, we're going to go to hearings on an expedited basis. We don't want children to kind of lose out in this time. So there's a regular machinery that happens in the court. What we said is we're willing to press pause, but you have to agree to an expedited hearing schedule if we get into that room and it looks like you're not going to stop the discrimination and we can't come to an agreement, because kids' lives are literally at stake.
So what is your reaction to what has unfolded with this decision, the pause, and now talks to come?
Yeah, well, I'm really disappointed about them even filing yet another piece of litigation against the kids. They have filed, actually, there's been 30 orders in this case, Katie. They've lost 29 of those. The one they won was overturned on appeal. So every time they raise one of these legal technicalities, they lose. But the problem is, when they litigate, is that children and families get hurt in the meantime. And that's what we got to stop. That's what I'm concerned about. So if it's sitting down and talking to them will work, great. If not, we'll go to the courtrooms again, because that's where we've been successful.
So when you sit down for those conversations with the government, what is it that you want?
Job number one, stop the discrimination. We have solutions to end the discrimination in First Nations Child and Family Services, the federal funding for that. Number two, fully implement the orders for Jordan's Principle. Number three, the federal government needs to withdraw its appeal on what's called the capital decision at federal court that it just filed in September for buildings, so that families can get the help that they need, given the housing crisis on reserve. And number four, the federal government needs to pay the $40,000 in human rights damages it owes to the victims of this discrimination. And Katie, just so your viewers understand, what these victims went through is that these children, in many cases, were in families experiencing multi-generational effects of residential schools that the feds put on those families. And then they had unequal services, so they couldn't really recover from it. And the kids were in foster care because of that federal discrimination. They grew up in foster care because the federal government didn't think they were worth the money. And other children even died in ways that were linked to the denial of services. So when you think about $40,000, that's just a small, small token of a recognition of the harms that were done to these people.
Part of what the government has argued throughout this process is that, and I'll get your reaction to this, they say that they're not opposed to compensation. Mm-hmm. That's not the issue there. But they take issue with the broad, they call it, this is their perspective, that the ruling was overbroad and overreach, and that it's a blanket payment to people involved. It's not sort of trauma-based payments. They've tried to make the argument that some people should get more than other people. What do you make of the government making that argument? And is that what you're expecting to hear from them when you're sitting down from talks?
Well, number one, on this idea that some people deserve more than the $40,000, I agree. But that doesn't mean you don't pay out the $40,000. Pay out the $40,000 and then figure out how to pay more. And on the question of all these questions they have about the law, well, that's the tribunal ruled. They had questions about that order. They appealed, and the federal court answered those questions. They said, government, you're wrong. Do the right thing and pay out the money. So that type of process where the government says they have jurisdictional questions overreached by the tribunal, that has been a long narrative in this case. And at every turn, we've been to federal court 7 times now, at every turn, the federal court has disagreed with the government.
So can you walk me through what the next steps are and what your short-term goals are here with this process?
Right. So I want to get into that room and I want to see if it's a real serious offer to end the discrimination. I've been around a long time. I've seen lots of talk and no action, and I measure success at the level of kids. I want the discrimination to stop, number one, because we don't want more victims. Every day there's more victims, there's more compensation to pay out. But number two, we need to make sure that the government meets its obligations to these victims. And number three, important, Katie, that we stop this from happening again. The government did residential schools, it didn't learn from it, it did the 60 scoop. It didn't learn from that, and now it's done the discrimination here. We as a country have a historical moment right now to make sure this is the last generation of kids that's hurt by the federal government. But we have to keep the pressure on.
You've said that throughout this 14-year battle, it's been one where your argument has won through the court system. I'm curious as to whether you think, are you hopeful that you can reach some sort of agreement with the government by that December, in those December talks?
Well, I'm always hopeful, and I've always been a person who doesn't just point out the problems, but actually comes with evidence-informed solutions along with other First Nations and the Assembly of First Nations who we've worked with for years on this. We have the solutions ready. What we need is the government to actually implement them and take the action. The children are just too precious. They only get one childhood, and that childhood doesn't get better by lofty statements by politicians. It gets better when the government stops the discrimination and treats these families with justice.
Okay, Ms. Blackstock, we're going to thank you very much for your time today, and perhaps we'll get more reaction from you, and we'll continue to get reaction to this story. We're just now waiting for the federal government. They're going to be holding a news conference a short time from now. We will be going to that live when it happens, but I want to say thank you, Cindy Blackstock. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.